in conversation with Gerry Pinto. Yann Martel is a Canadian author best known for the Man Booker Prize-winning novel Life of Pi, an international bestseller published in more than 50 territories. It has sold more than 12 million copies worldwide and was adapted for the screen. The film version was directed by Ang Lee, and it won 4 Academy Awards, including for Best Director. Gerry Pinto is the author of the critically acclaimed novels M and the Big Hoom and Murder in Mahim. He has translated several important works from Marathi, and his first Hindi translation will appear shortly. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guests this morning, Yann Martel and Gerry Pinto. This session is presented by the Patrika Game Changer series.
We break you open with music and we prepare you for words. So I hope you enjoyed Kabir and the beauty of the music this morning, and you're ready for an encounter with the life of Pi, words, numbers with the life of Yann. First, a warning. We've decided that we're deconstructing the title. This is not going to be whatever, before and after Pi. It's going to be about, in this moment, Yann Martel. This moment and these words, yeah? Because before and after Pi, those are just moments that happen to us. Thank you. Yann, here we are, and it is wonderful to finally meet you. My first question really is about language, because you're Spanish-born. You've said that French is your first language, that it is the language closest to your heart, and that you write in English because English provides the necessary distance with which you write. I'd like you to expand a little on that, because you're in a country where language is an almost constant source of anxiety almost. And the language of our hearts is often not the language of power. And so we constantly struggle. We are in a constant dialectic with language.
That's a very good question. First of all, good morning. It's wonderful to be here. I would say that it's the same thing in Canada. Language is a source of anxiety in Canada, in a more positive way than it is in the United States, where there's this fear of Spanish. Now, it's sort of a happenstance that I've been caught up in this maelstrom of languages. I was born in Spain, but of Canadian parents, so it's sort of a happenstance that I was born in Spain. But the fact is, my parents moved around a lot, so though I speak French at home, and I never speak English to my parents, it would feel wrong to speak French to my parents. And the odd times when my brother speaks to me in English, which he does as a matter of convenience sometimes, it always irks me. And I always reply to him in French to sort of correct him and tell him switch to the other language, the language we should be speaking because we're brothers. So despite the fact that I speak French at home, and it's my mother tongue, I always went to school in English. My parents worked for the Foreign Service. We moved around the world. The fact is, English is an international language spoken everywhere, and there were more English schools out there than there are French schools. And so I just happened to go to school in English. Now, frankly, if I'd gone to school in Albanian, I would have written in Albanian. It wasn't a choice I made. It was a choice that was imposed on me, but I went with quite happily. The fact is, I love all languages, but the strength of English, I find, is its extraordinary plasticity, its extraordinary flexibility. There's not English, there's Englishes. There's Indian English, there's Jamaican English, there's Canadian English, there's Englishes all over the world. And it's extraordinary vocabulary. It's very simplified grammar. All of that appeals to me. And so when it came time for me to write, it felt natural that I'd write in English because it's the language in which I learned how to think. So I may feel in French, but I think in English most accurately. And also, as you pointed out, writing in a language that is not my native language allowed me a certain distance. And that's not unique to me. You see that with, for example, Samuel Beckett, who despite being very Irish, chose to write in French, because that allowed him to step away and look back with a degree of lucidity. And it sort of happens to be the same thing with me. And what I found most useful about speaking French and Spanish is it allows me access to a greater dictionary. So there'll be times when I'm writing in English, which I don't usually think of. I don't write in English, I just write. But occasionally, I search for a word. And I can't think of it in English, and I'll think about it in a different language. And one that often comes up is a wonderful French word, mépris. Mépris. Also the name of a Godard movie. And I always forget what it is in English. So there's the odd word that I remember in another language, and I have to go to a dictionary, a bilingual dictionary, to find the equivalent in English. So it gives me a certain distance, and it gives me access to this extraordinary, powerful language, the English language. So I'm quite happy writing in English. I'm not usually troubled by linguistic questions. I've managed to avoid the intense politics to do with it in Quebec, because I don't live in Quebec anymore. I live in Saskatchewan. And one of the reasons, in fact, I left Quebec is I got tired of the politics associated with language. It's a pity, because languages don't fight. It's people who fight. Just as gods don't fight, it's languages that fight. And I got tired of that endless worrying about national identity that you get in Quebec. I happened to choose to write in English. I didn't choose it as a political tool of oppression on anyone. It just happens to be the language I write in. Whereas in Saskatchewan, where I live, it's largely an Anglophone province, and people are untroubled by the fact that I write in English.
I just want to ask the audience a question just now. How many of you had a troubled relationship with numbers and mathematics growing up? Put up your hands bravely. It's okay. It's gone behind you. Yeah. Yeah. I just wanted to find out, because I taught mathematics myself. And actually, mathematics is another system of language. It is, numbers are adjectives, equations are sentences, plus, minus, verbs. These are things, except that mathematics is a language in which meaning is really, really carefully fixed, and it is fixed only by consensus. We all agree on numbers. So I wanted to ask you about about pi. You know, the fact that pi never recurs is always held up as this kind of beautiful, strange, mystical thing, but no irrational number recurs. And pi is an irrational number. So what do you think is the fascination behind pi?
Well, that has less to do with mathematics and more my sense of things must have meaning. That's the great thing about art. Art takes the randomness of life and imposes some kind of order. Plots have novels, poetry have form. They all have a method and a structure that imposes meaning. And so when I was writing Life of Pi, it mattered to me that things be significant. So first of all, when I write a book, unlike some writers, and André Assiman is an example of a different kind of writer from me, apparently he starts his books not knowing where they're going. Michael Ondaatje does the same thing. He starts with an idea, and he just lets him guide him, and he doesn't know where it's going to go. I don't do that at all. I very much work on the structure of a novel from beginning to end. So with Life of Pi, for example, when I started the author's note, I knew exactly how the book would end, down to the last sentence. I didn't know everything in between necessarily. I played around with the order of some things. But before I write, I work out everything through conceptually. And so things have to have meaning. So pi is significant on many levels. Yes, as Gerry pointed out, it's an irrational number. A number with no end, 3.1415926. It goes on forever. It's an irrational number. Yet pi is very religious. So to my mind, religion, like art, is slightly irrational. It doesn't quite make sense, but it helps us make sense of the world. In the same way that irrational numbers, a mathematical concept, helps us make sense of the world. We need irrational numbers to understand the world. It's used a lot in mathematics. In the same thing with religion. It is slightly irrational, but it helps us make sense of the world. There are other mathematical things in the book too. For example, pi is at sea for 227 days. That's a number I chose rather arbitrarily. He had to be at sea for a number of days. Of course, a castaway would count his days at sea. He would not forget. So if he's going to choose a number, what would that number be? It had to be, in my mind, at least in mine, to be significant. And it happens that 227 was roughly how many days I wanted pi to be at sea, and I discovered it was a prime number. Now, a prime number, as you who've forgotten mathematics, I will remind you, is a number that is divisible only by itself, 227, or by 1. So in other words, my thinking, and it's not one that the readers would sense, was that since pi tells two stories, I didn't want those stories to be divisible. I didn't want you to take 1/4 of this story, 2/3 of that one, and 1/5 of that one and mix it all together. No, the stories have to be indivisible. You either believe the story with animals or you believe the story without animals. Each one is a prime number. So I chose 227, thinking that no one, maybe some people would notice, oh, it's a prime number, and they might think it's deeply symbolic. It's not particularly, just arbitrary. However, one very astute reader pointed out to me that 227, 22/7, is the closest fraction to pi. Divide 22 by 7 and you get something that's reasonably close to 3.14. Now that's one of these instances where I hadn't noticed that. So it's something where readers brought something to the novel that I had not noticed. And so every other number in the book is also chosen. The other thing that I liked about Pi is that Pi is his nickname, but his full name is Piscine. Now Piscine is a pool. Most pools, except for pools in hotels, most pools tend to be rectangular. That's a logical shape for a pool if you're going to do lengths. So it's a rectangular. It makes sense as a shape. Here's a boy who's named after a rectangular shape, and he's cast away in the Pacific, which has no rational shape. It has the shape that it has. So here you have a rational name who's stuck in a rational body of water, a swimming pool, but he's stuck in this irrationally shaped body of water called the Pacific Ocean. So I kept on playing with these ideas so that they'd be significant at least to me and perhaps picked up by readers.
I think that's fascinating because when I was reading the book, I started with this notion of you let yourself go into a novel. You just flow into a novel, because otherwise, if you're going to stand outside and read the novel at a distance, then you're actually going to be a critic. But if you're just a reader, just someone who's enjoying reading, then you flow into the novel. But at the moment at which Pi, in his rational self, is in a rational boat, in an irrational sea, with a tiger, a hungry tiger, not a friendly tiger. My thought was, I actually at that moment came out of your ocean of story, and I came and I stood on the side and I said, what does he mean here? And then as I read more Yann Martel, I realized that everything is a codex of meaning. If you take Beatrice and Virgil, for instance, the names are from Dante. Dante gestures towards hell. Hell gestures towards the Holocaust. The Holocaust gestures towards a moral certainty in Western Europe, which is now missing. You can go back to the Holocaust and tell a moral tale. Where else will you go in Western history where the moral has not been corrupted by the commercial? So I wonder sometimes, Yann, when people have the wonderful task of reading your book and then writing a review, it's like, how are they supposed to try and say what is going on in a novel where so many things are possibly going on, and everything seems almost like it could be a sign that is only barely, vaguely concealed, but it's there. That sign is there. You keep feeling that don't you think that in a Yann Martel novel? This must mean something. This, he's saying something and I'm not getting it, but I want to.
It strikes me that all of us seek to understand, seek meaning. I studied philosophy at university, and I guess studying philosophy rather than literature, although I did take some English literature classes, I studied philosophy because I think it suited my natural bent, which was to think about things and try to figure them out. And in a very personal way, not in a scientific way, in a sort of philosophical, personal way of what does this mean? And so every book I've written has been an attempt, at least a conscious attempt, but there's obviously unconscious things happening, has been a conscious attempt to understand some issue. So with Life of Pi, it was an attempt to understand that curious phenomenon called faith, whereby we believe in things for which we have no proof. You fall in love with someone and he is the most handsome man you've ever met, she is the most beautiful woman you've ever met. Well, that's your leap of faith. Everyone else may think, well, he looks like a dwarf to me. But to you, love, which is what faith is a leap into the unknown, where you make assumptions that you can't warrant, that you can't back up, and you believe in things for which you have no proof. It's a wonderful, strange mechanism that is unique to the human species. And so faith religious faith specifically, which is the grandest kind of faith, the one that makes the most outrageous claims, struck me as interesting that because it still exists in the 21st century when rationality and science and logic have so triumphed. How can there still be gods in this era where the science and technology has triumphed? So I was puzzled by that. So I wrote Life of Pi to try to understand the mechanism of faith. And I came to see that, in fact, the mechanism of religion is the same mechanism as the mechanism of art. That a novel works when it makes you suspend your disbelief. A religion works when it makes you suspend your disbelief. And if it doesn't make you suspend your disbelief, it's called a cult. A cult is a negative thing. A cult doesn't make you suspend your disbelief. A religion does. Hindus here believe in Hinduism because the improbabilities of Shiva, Vishnu, Krishna, and Brahma and all that, you suspend your disbelief and you believe it. And then you use your reason to make sense of Hinduism. And that's the same with every other religion. And same thing in storytelling. A novel works when you suspend your disbelief. You believe the characters, you believe the situation, etc. So I wrote Life of Pi to understand that, faith. And Beatrice and Virgil was to understand the Holocaust, the massacre of Jews in Europe between 33 and 45. I have no personal connection to that whatsoever. I'm not Jewish. My families have been in Canada for 400 years, so I have no personal, ethnic, narrative connection to the Holocaust. It's a completely alien tragedy to me. But it's one that's always interested me because it doesn't fit with the rest of history. No genocides fit with the rest of history. We all understand war. I have a brother, so I understand war. When I squabble with my brother, it's World War II writ little. And the same thing, I have 4 children. When they squabble, I'm witnessing, the First World War. I'm witnessing partition. But genocide is something different. Because after all, if you think of war, in war, everyone has a role to play, and that role can change. You can be a soldier who becomes a general, who becomes a traitor, who becomes a hero. In genocide, there's no mutability of character. No matter what you are, who you are hated for one reason. And if you're the hater, you don't care who you're hating, you just hate them. There's a fixity to genocides. Anyway, the Holocaust always stayed with me. And I wrote Beatrice and Virgil not so much to explore the tragedy itself historically, because that is very well documented, extremely well documented. What I was trying to do with Beatrice and Virgil is ask myself, why are we so limited when we talk about the Holocaust? Because if you think about the Holocaust and its representations, they're extraordinarily limited. The dominant genre when we discuss the Holocaust is nonfiction. The single most popular text about the Holocaust is the Diary of Anne Frank. I can't think of any other historical event where the diary of a teenage girl is so central. And the big tomes on the Holocaust that are the ones that are the go-to texts are all works of nonfiction. And when you get fiction, it's very thinly disguised biography or autobiography. So Night by Elie Wiesel, for example, is very much the history of himself and his father, very thinly disguised in using the very thin layers of fiction. It's pretty well the same thing with every novel you can think about with the Holocaust. There is a fear of fiction with the Holocaust. And people will say, well, it's obvious because it's so tragic. But my answer is, well, look at war. War is tragic. The First World War cost the lives of 20 million people at the very least. At the very least, 20 million, including civilians, women, children. It's equally appalling. And yet, look how free we are when we think about war. Very few people get nervous talking about war. We don't mind war romances, war adventures, war jokes. We're not nervous talking about war. People get nervous talking about the Holocaust. And there's a suspicion of the imagination. And so in writing Beatrice and Virgil, I want to ask myself, why are we so nervous? And what do we lose when we limit how we talk about great, great tragedy, about genocide? Do we lose something when we don't accept certain narrative categories like Holocaust jokes, or Holocaust science fictions, or Holocaust westerns, or masala holocausts? Do we lose something by not playing with great tragedy? And my conclusion is yes, because if you don't play with it, and I don't say play in a trivial sense, I mean exercise your mental gymnastic on it, don't we lose perspective? And I believe we do, because we see war as endlessly contemporary. Whereas we don't with the Holocaust. First of all, it has that proper name, Holocaust with a capital H. Whereas war always comes with a small w, and yes, you're talking about a specific war, then it has a capital W. With the Holocaust, I find the Holocaust is more a black and white, dust-covered historical event from a long time ago, and we think of it in very fixed terms. So in Beatrice and Virgil, I tried to do the complete opposite. I tried to apply all the tools of fiction to it. So allegory, it's a story set on a shirt, a very large shirt, featuring a monkey and a donkey. It's as fable-like as I could. The animals are anthropomorphized, unlike in Life of Pi. They speak English to each other. I was trying to apply as many of the tools, so that hence the number of literary references in Beatrice and Virgil. Why Beatrice and Virgil? Because in the Divine Comedy, they are Dante's guide through hell and purgatory. And that's what we want with tragedy. We want some kind of understanding, we want some kind of redemption, some kind of sense that we can go on. That after great tragedy, we shouldn't add to it by all committing collective suicide. The surviving Jews of Europe, 1/3 of them, 2/3 were killed in the Holocaust. Those 1/3 had to somehow keep on going, and we need to help them. And so we need all the tools that language and literature can bring to it. So I use the one of Dante. As I said, Beatrice and Virgil are Dante's guides through hell and purgatory. And all the other references are references that I'm saying, well, let's try to lean on this. Can this possibly help? Can that possibly help? And the whole point of doing that is that it's my belief that fiction tends to have broader wings than nonfiction. Stories sail through time in a way that histories don't. You have to be a student of history to understand the Holocaust, but few of us are students of history. It's best if history is expressed as story. Because we still read stories from 1,000 years ago. We still read Dante's Divine Comedy, for example, which is from the Middle Ages. It's rare that we read histories from that time. As a species, we like stories. Stories are a great way to understand very complex things. Stories get to the essence of things. So if the Holocaust doesn't survive as story, I'm afraid it will not survive as well as it should, and hence the danger of the repetition of more genocides.
In this, go on then, clap properly. Yeah. Of course, obviously, everything you said is just endlessly fascinating, and I could have 20 questions jump out of each line, but let's just look at this meaning thing that is obviously very important to you. It's as if writing for you, or writing the novel, is a way of explaining that which fundamentally resists explanation by being so various, which is the experience of life. That each of us is not just a story, but many stories. And everyone in this audience will take away a different Yann Martel and a different conversation between the two of us and make it their own. So in this almost unlimited buffet of meaning, how do you choose the tools or the things that you will explain to yourself? Is it, I'm sorry.
No, that's a good one. Well, it comes down, I think, to who we are, to personal taste. For example, Life of Pi came to me because I came to India. There's something about India that I connected with. Of course, that's my subject judgment. You may say he understood nothing about India, but I came to India, and there's something that was... I was drying up when I came to India, and India nourished me with its monsoon rains. Whereas if I'd gone somewhere else, maybe I wouldn't have been so nourished. So I think we seek all meaning. We seek meaning in some form or another. And there's an element of luck involved in whether we find it. And when you find it, that's where you want to use your reason. As I said earlier, once you make that leap of faith, then you use your reason to hone what exactly it is that you found and how you can best serve it. But yeah, no, India, what India brought to me, as Yer just said, is multiplicity. India is a vast buffet. not just to foreigners, but to yourselves. It's just mind-blowing, the diversity of things that you see in India that you just don't see elsewhere in the world anymore. Like, I'll give you just one very obvious example.
By the way, now you're clapping for yourselves, and that's not
Yes,
nice.
you are. You know, for example, I love Canada. Don't mistake that I'm in some way disliking Canada when I say this, but in Canada, you just don't have sadhus. The first time I met a sadhu, he was half naked, he had a massive white beard, and he was holding a trident. And I was just saying, wow, this is one extreme of how one can live. And then, you know, at the other, you have the India of, you know, democracy, science, logic, Nobel Prize winners, great, you know, civilizational achievements. But it's all there to be seen and selected and loved or hated. And it really shook me. It really, really shook me. I said, India's a wonderful place. It's also, what I find what's extraordinary about India is that whatever gain and whatever pain is right there. The pain here is palpable. You see it every day. It is a tough country to live in. There are many cracks and some people fall through them. But they're not hidden the way we do in Canada. You know, I live in Saskatchewan, which is a terribly racist province. The First Nations of Canada, the indigenous people, what used to be called the Indians, the other Indians, you know, we've disseminated, we've destroyed their culture through colonialism. British, but then our own colonialism. We've wrecked their culture. And now we're belatedly attempting truth and reconciliation. And it's difficult. When you have people whose cultures have been completely devastated, you see the walking wounded, but we try to hide them. What I find in India is because I guess there's so many of you, you can't really hide it. The pain is on the surface. So to me, India is very much a thought-provoking country. To me, I come here and I have endless questions to myself about what it means to be human. So it's a very philosophically engaging country.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was beautifully said. Just to, you know, because otherwise India will come into this room and take over.
Just so long as it's not Prime Minister Modi.
Yeah. Loud clap. Clap with your heart, I always say, doesn't matter. I'm saying, just to get back to your writing, you know, one of the joys of coming and doing something like this is that you are required to go back to books that you have experienced and you get to re-experience them from a different self. This is a new Gerry from the Gerry that read, you know, Life of Pi and Beatrice and Virgil so many years ago. So that was really wonderful. But what and now that Gerry was not a novelist, this Gerry is a novelist, a little bit of a novelist. Nothing in your league, but trying. Anyway, so I remember reading them and thinking, oh my God, he keeps taking risks with the form. He keeps balancing on the edge of probability. Like, I mean, 227 days of wakefulness between an animal and a person. I could only read that section if I believed that this was the ego and the superego and the id in the middle of life. So I said, okay, I'll read it. I gave myself permission to read it that way. Then, this time I could read it and say, there is a tiger and a boy in a boat. What's your issue? And each time, I mean, with the high mountains of Portugal, with Beatrice and Virgil, you're just constantly breaking down the form and trying something new, just like living on the edge of the precipice.
Yes, well, I think art is inherently is a risk. You take a risk when you try to make art of any form, whether it's music, dance, painting, opera, whatever. You take a risk, you should take a risk. There's no particular point in repeating a formula or trying to replicate something you've done before. And as I said, I try to understand, and there's different ways of understanding different things. So I believe in that kind of playfulness. If you don't renew yourself, then you dry up, you become desiccated, and your art form does too, and then it loses interest, and then why bother reading it? Art is a form of exploration, is a form of seeking to understand, and therefore you ask to have new questions and express them in new forms. So every novel, for example, my next novel is going to be set during the Trojan War, and it's going to be a novel in two voices, and they'll be expressed quite visually. On the top half of the page, you're going to have these fragments from antiquity discovered by a scholar who will comment on these fragments on the bottom half of the page. So there'll be an alternation of things from the antiquity on the top half of the page, and on the bottom half there'll be nothing. There'll be a blank, maybe the odd, very short footnote. And once that fragment ends, there'll be commentary on the bottom half of several pages while there's nothing on top. So there'll be a dialogue between antiquity and modernity, between the fiction of these fragments and the non-fiction of the scholar, who of course is fictitious. Discussion between fiction and non-fiction, between sense and actually understanding that sense. I like that dialogue there. So that's sort of an unusual format, but it's the one that came most naturally to me to try to understand what I'm doing, to sort of see what am I making. And the thing that I'm exploring, the reason I chose the Trojan War is what has fascinated me is that the Trojan War is the foundational myth of the Greek people. The Greek people would not be who they are without the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were the very first books of the West. Until then, we'd been an oral people, and then roughly in the 7th century, the Greeks took the Phoenician alphabet, added some vowels, tweaked it a bit, and then had this alphabet. And they started writing down things, and the very first thing they wrote down was this big fat oral tome called the Iliad, and then right afterwards the Odyssey. It is the first book of the West, the foundational book of Western secular society, and definitely the foundational book of the Greek people. And the other foundational book of the Western people, of course, are the Gospels. And the Gospels, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, are works of fiction. Now, if there are any Christians in this audience, I'm not belittling Christianity in any way by saying that. I'm just simply saying that the truthful story of Jesus was expressed not in historical terms, but in the terms of fiction. The Gospels use every literary tool, metaphor, allegory, symbolism, parable. It is a literary text that through the imagination expresses the Christian truth of the life of Jesus. So what strikes me, is that the two foundational books of the West are works of fiction. Before we are, we dream. And the West dreamed with the Iliad and the Gospels, and then got their business going of being Westerners. And that, I believe, is how all societies work. They first start as a dream, and then the dream gets real. And so in this book, I want to discuss that. And so what I'm doing is I'm positing an alternate tradition to the Homeric tradition. Because, of course, the Trojan War, whatever it was, this mythological event, this fiction in the past, something obviously happened between the city of Troy in northwestern Anatolia, northwestern Turkey. Something happened between that city of Troy and these troublesome, quarreling people eventually called the Greek people. Something happened. And it was expressed in many, many ways. And the greatest stories that came out of it were the Iliad and the Odyssey. But there were many other stories told about the Trojan War, many other ones, what became known as the epic cycle. And most of those have been lost because they were poorly told stories that didn't hold well together the way the Iliad and the Odyssey does. So there were competing traditions. So I'm positing another tradition that would have been ultimately suppressed by the Homeric tradition. And what got me interested in that is that in the Iliad, every single character who speaks is either a king or a queen or some blue blood of one sort or another, some royalty or nobleman or noblewoman of one sort or another. There's only a single commoner who speaks. In Indian terms, it's only a single Dalit who speaks. And he's a character named Thersites. And Thersites, in Book 2 of the Iliad, gets angry at Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks, and starts berating him, saying, "You're a useless human being. Why are we here? We've been here for 9 years, dying for you, and all you're doing is gathering women to screw and treasures to hoard, while we die for nothing. Why should we be here?" So Thersites, the commoner, questions the whole system, the way Achilles does later on. But Thersites does it in a more radical way. And what happens to Thersites is he's immediately nearly beaten to death by Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, who says to him in essence, "You are a dog, and it is a dog's role to obey. So shut up and go back to your tent." And Thersites crawls back to his tent, and you never hear from him later, except in an alternate tradition, he is killed by Achilles. It struck me, here you have one commoner who speaks, and he speaks good sense. He says perfectly rational, understandable things. So I'm positing a story where another commoner named Soas equally questions the whole system. He tells an alternate retelling of the Trojan War from the point of view of a commoner. And his message is one, why am I doing this? Who cares about antiquity? Because, of course, antiquity speaks to us today. And my perspective from this is an anti-plutocratic, not rant, but discourse. We live in a world, and I'm sure India is the same as in Canada and the US, where the rich keep on getting rich and the poor keep on getting poorer, and the middle class is getting squeezed. In Canada and the US, you have the triumph of plutocrats, of these billionaires, these multi-billionaires, while the middle class in the US is shrinking, which to me is outrageous. It's a theft of what belongs to all of us. The wealth of this earth, this is a very Muslim point of view, the wealth of the earth belongs to all of us. It belongs to all of us, to none of us. It has to be shared. And so I want to take this commoner's perspective to completely reanalyze this plutocratic story told of these Greek kings who come to Troy, destroy it, and steal everything from it.
Okay. When we were talking earlier, just before this, we decided that we'd do something radical, which is we wouldn't just tag the audience on with 10 minutes at the end of questions, as if they were not part of this living discourse that we're all having. So even though it's almost half of the session, we're going to open to questions right now. And put up your hands if you have something to say. We'll have lots from Yann if you keep your question short. There's one lady over there at the back. Put up your hand bravely, ma'am, otherwise you're going to be ignored. Yeah. There's second, 1, 2, 3, I see. Yeah, I'll get to you.
Lata Sharma, I want to know about those meerkats, millions and millions of them. I couldn't understand what are those meerkats all about.
Question about the meerkats. It's interesting, when Life of Pi was going strong, the most common question I got was, first of all, which story is true? And then about the island. So very quickly to tell you my narrative strategy when I wrote Life of Pi, what I was trying to do is tell two stories based on the same set of facts. The sinking of a ship and the arrival 227 days later of one human survivor on the coast of Mexico. Those facts are shared by both stories, but Pi overlays two radically different stories, one with animals, one without. Now, I didn't want those stories to be of the same quality. I didn't want to be a banal choice between, vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream. I wanted them to be qualitatively different. So the story without animals is a flat, horrible story. The kind that we're all willing to believe. We're all willing to believe that when things get rough, we will get rough with each other, that we will not hold together and try to save each other. But instead, the dominant will kill the weak, and it'll be a sort of a bestial, horrible story. We're all willing to believe that. And then the other story, I wanted it to be more marvelous, just as full of suffering. In both, Pi loses his family, but I wanted it to be increasingly unbelievable. So will a boy survive in a lifeboat with a tiger? You climb on board. Will he go blind and meet another blind person in another lifeboat when he is blind and his tiger is blind? 3 blind entities meeting in the middle of the Pacific on 2 separate lifeboats. I mean, how likely is that? You stay on board. Then I wanted to push it even further with the island. I wanted you to get to the island and say, this I can no longer believe. My faith is faltering. Your rationality is going to kick in. You're going to seek deep meaning. And nonetheless continue. The trick with the island was that I wanted you to keep on reading while disbelieving, which is hard. Usually when a story loses its credibility, it loses its interest. So I had to keep the island interesting. So you'd keep on reading the island, get off it, get to Mexico, hear the second story, say, oh, I don't like that story. I'm going to come back to the first story. But if you're going to believe that, remember that prime number story, you can't divide it. If you're going to believe the first story, you had to take it all in. You had to stop being reasonable, believe the island, and believe the cute little meerkats. The meerkats have no deep meaning. They're just these really cute little animals that have funny little habits that would lure you animal-loving people in. They're very sociable, they're not aggressive. They do eat scorpions, though. Not many creatures eat scorpions. Meerkats do. So I just threw them in there because initially I thought of mongooses, because mongooses are quite commonly found on ships, but mongooses are actually extremely aggressive creatures. I said, well, that won't do. What else could I use? And I thought, oh, meerkats. They're funny little creatures. So I threw in the meerkats just to, as I said, lure you in. In a sense, Beatrice and Virgil guide you through Helen, Purgatory of Holocaust. The meerkats guide you through the island. I just want you to stay there warm and cuddly with the meerkats so that you'd stay with me on the island.
Okay, will you pass the mic to the gentleman in the front row here and then to the lady at the back in the black and white with the red scarf? If you have a question, put up your hand so I can put you in. You're the next one.
Thank you, Yann, for being here. My question is, once you write your books, so do you reread it after 10 years or 15 years? Then you come back, oh, I left out something I want to include in my future novels. Have you thought about like that?
No, I never reread my stuff. In fact, I forget my own books, so I make mistakes about my own books, because no, I never reread them. As I said, once I explore a question, I'm answered to my satisfaction. So for example, I wrote Life of Pi to understand faith. I understand faith now. I still hate the bad things of religion, the patriarchy, the homophobia, the sexism, the anti-Semitism. I hate that, but I love the magical thinking of religion. It's the way it changes reality. So now that I got that, why should I bother reading Life of Pi? So I've moved on now. It's a past incarnation of my curiosity.
The next one is over there. Please, in order.
I wish to ask that in the book, it's just the sea. Why not some other place, some other isolated place? Why not a desert or some other forest, something like that? Why is it the sea?
Yeah.
Why not some other place?
I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember. Oh yes, I was accused of plagiarism for this. It's funny, many things come in creating art. And one of them, of course, is influence. I mean, I suppose you do have artists who are totally original. Literally, it comes out of nowhere that anyone's ever thought of, but I'm not one of those. So there's many things that influenced me. As I told you earlier, obviously India was a major influence. If I literally had traveled to Switzerland in 2000, I would have written a radically different novel, but it happened to be India. So India was a big part of what created Life of Pi. But another one was a review. I read, I think it was 7 or 8 years before I came to India. So the early 90s, I happened to read a review of a Brazilian novel by a writer named Moacir Scliar, whom I'd never heard of. It was a novella called Max and the Cats. And in that novella, in the review, it mentions that the character ends up in a lifeboat with a wild animal. And I remember thinking, God, that's a really good premise. You know, this reduction of Noah's Ark and this opposition between two very different entities, the human and the animal, that's a very clever premise. Just like, you know, Kafka's premise of someone waking up and they're a big beetle, that's also a very clever premise. I just thought, I said, I couldn't find the book. It wasn't published, it wasn't distributed in Canada. And so I just completely forgot about it. And then I came to India. And India has a lot of gods and a lot of animals. Canada is a secular country, no gods, and a temperate country, no animals that you see in cities. So here I am in the opposite of my country, and I see these gods and these animals. And in between the two are the humans. You know, gods are at one extreme of existence, animals are at the other. We're sort of sliding in between the two. We are animals, we are biologically animals, but we aspire to gods. So it struck me. And so I was on this rock in Mathiran, a hill station near Bombay, looking at life. A novel I meant to write on Portugal had failed, so I had nothing to do but be in India. So I opened my eyes and saying, what am I going to do here? I'm sort of in my 30s, I'm going nowhere. I wrote 2 books that had gone nowhere. I'm screwed. And I'm on top of this rock in Mathiran, and suddenly it all came together. I remember that premise of the shipwreck, and I thought, oh wow, I could do something for it. And suddenly that borrowed premise opened itself up, and Life of Pi came to me all in one moment, basically. Initially, the animal was going to be a black panther, then an Indian elephant, then an Indian rhinoceros, and then finally a tiger. But conceptually, it came together right away. And so I guess because of that novella, Max and the Cats, I thought of the shipwreck. But also there's something I love about shipwrecks anyway. As a young man, as a child at school once in Paris, as an academic prize, I'd been given a book called Survive the Savage Sea. Try to say that 10 times over. Survive the Savage Sea, by a man, a Scottish farmer who realized that his children were becoming hicks, very, cut off from the world. So he decided to travel around. He used to be in the Merchant Marine. So he bought this yacht and they started traveling around the world. Their yacht was attacked by killer whales. Imagine that. Just west of the Galapagos Islands. And he, his wife, their 2 twins and a daughter, and a Welsh hitchhiker ended up on this tiny little raft, little boat in the Pacific. And he survived for 21 days, and they were rescued, very luckily. And he wrote this wonderful book about survival at sea. And so I'd read that when I was maybe 14, 15. And I was thinking, oh, that's so cool. I'd love to be a shipwreck survivor. Wouldn't it be fun? And so when on that little rock in Mathiran, it all came together. The review, the shipwreck story, the animals, the gods, it all came together. And so I chose that because an ocean strikes me as a very, first of all, real place, and it lends itself to many interpretations. An ocean can be a terrible place where you drown. It's also a place where many things live, obviously marine life. It's a particularly beautiful place, whereas to me a desert now perhaps it's a reflection of my ignorance, a desert is still a forbidding place. It is a place that kills life. Of course, there's some animal forms and plant forms that manage to survive, but it's a much harsher environment in my imaginative perception of things than an ocean. There's a sort of a fertility to oceans that I enjoyed. And the crossing of an ocean, which we do all the time, ships do all the time, strikes me as a good metaphor for the passage of one's life. Whereas the crossing of a desert strikes me as emphatically an ordeal. There's something more mutable about a crossing of an ocean. So it just was one that struck me as being very rich in meaning.
I'm just going to say one thing in between. When you open a plastic, if you think about the fertility of the ocean and you love it, when you open a plastic bottle of water, please make sure that you drink the whole thing at the very least. Don't leave half bottles around. That's really nasty. Thank you so much. That's
Hi, Gerry. Hi, Yann. Here. Yann, thank you for Life of Pi. 2 quick questions here.
Two quick questions. One.
What? Okay. So you mentioned that you came to India when you were drying up. So what other countries or places do you visit that nourish you? And another quick thing is you mentioned that nobody knows Saskatoon. I've been to Saskatoon 4 years ago.
Bless you. Many countries have nourished me. I mean, there's no hierarchy here. But another country that has been very, very rewarding for me has been Turkey. Turkey is a fascinating society. Like India, it is a secular society, but one with strong religious identity. Overwhelmingly Muslim in Turkey, whereas India has much more varied. But it's also a startling place. You know, India is where Santa Claus comes from. St. Nicholas was a Turkish bishop. Noah's Ark landed on Mount Ararat in Turkey. There's many things in Turkey that have nourished the Western imagination. And I found it a really incredible country. But honestly, every country, you know, I can think of a few cities of the world that I didn't like. I didn't particularly like St. Louis in the US. It used to be a great city. It had the Olympics. It had a World Fair. At one point, it was a great city. Whereas when I went there on a literary tour, I thought it was nothing but horrible suburbs. And so I can think of odd cities that haven't nourished me. But really, every country I've been to has nourished me. I lived 10 years in France. I lived in Mexico. I lived in Costa Rica. I've traveled all through Europe. With Life of Pi, I traveled the world. Every country has something startling to tell me. But it's like, you know, countries are like cuisines. I really love Indian food. I don't particularly like Chinese food. There's nothing wrong with Chinese food. Please don't be offended. There's nothing wrong with Chinese food. I personally, my stomach doesn't particularly like Chinese food. I think countries are like that too. Some countries nourish us more than others. But there's all food to be had in all of them. But Turkey and India are the first one that I'd say right off the bat that have really startled me.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Akanksha. My question is, the title says it is the life of Pi, right? The life of a person is actually the whole of it from 0 to 80 or 60 or whatever. But you said that the story on the sea is actually the life of Pi. So how do we relate the story to the title? It's not actually whole of the life of it has, it's actually a part of it. So how do we relate it?
Well, by the title, one of these little mistakes that kind of irks me is that people call the novel The Life of Pi. And when I was conceiving this story, I thought of calling it The Life of Pi. But the is a definite article. The is one life. And since the novel is about multiplicity and the choice, the subjective choice we have in how we read our lives, I didn't want a definite article. So I thought, well, I could call it A Life of Pi, an indefinite article. But A Life of Pi is kind of annoying in English, A Life of Pi. So I thought, well, let's just do away with the article at all. It's just Life of Pi. So it's not the whole Life of Pi or a partial Life of Pi. It's just a life. It's just Life of Pi. And you can read that any which way you want. Of course, it's not the entirety of his life. He isn't born, he's not born when he's shipwrecked, and he doesn't get to age 80 when he reaches Mexico. That would be an incredibly long shipwreck story. It was just, but it's the most significant part of it. You know, significance comes when we suffer. Happy, happy, happy people have no questions, and I feel probably have no meaning. They're just happy, happy, happy. They laugh their entire ways and they die. I can't conceive of a human life like that. I think life becomes significant once we start suffering. And it's out of suffering that we create meaning. So Life of Pi is significant because there's a shipwreck. The whole story starts because there's a shipwreck. If there had been no shipwreck, there would have been no Life of Pi. There is a Life of Pi because of that shipwreck, and that's the source, that's the font of meaning for Pi.
Will you please stand up? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for this.
Okay, by the way, just before she starts, when you clap for suffering, be very careful. Be very careful. All I have to say.
Okay, I just want to say thank you and a quick question. So Elizabeth Gilbert speaks, and she's very popular on TED for this. She talks about the elusive creative genius. And I feel like you have this genius in your pocket or is walking around you, you know, where you come up with these great ideas and you know who's the next character. It could be just the meerkats. I'm curious, can you give us a little bit of insight into the grueling process of writing itself?
The actual process of writing. Yeah, I mentioned it a bit yesterday. As I said, I'm very methodical, I'm very, I guess, philosophical, so things have ramifications, you follow them through. It first starts with an idea. Now, unlike some other writers, my ideas are rarely, I'm never driven by character. I never think of a character first. I rarely think of a setting first. To me, it's more, and it sounds negative when I say cerebral, but it's usually an idea in my head. But it has to be an idea that has an emotional side. So, you know, the idea of pi, of facts, multiplicity of stories, that's kind of a device, an intellectual idea. But at its heart, there's suffering, a shipwreck. So all my stories start with an emotion that is filtered through the intellect, that is sorted out through the intellect. Because you can't have a story that is purely intellectual, otherwise it has no emotional pull, and then why bother? Art is ultimately emotional. But it can't just be emotion, because emotion fizzes up and then disappears, like a pop song. You're enraptured for 2 minutes, then you forget it. Art that is durable, I think, is emotionally appealing. It is beautiful, perhaps. It is upsetting. But it can't just be that. It also has to stay in your mind intellectually. So it's that balance between the intellectual and the emotional that is what I'm seeking in an idea. So once I get that idea, there's a click in my mind. And then I start doing research. So I read, because fundamentally I'm ignorant. So Life of Pi, I read about religion. I knew nothing about religion when I started writing Life of Pi. Or I only knew enough to dislike it. I knew the Catholics don't like Jews, so I don't like the Catholics. I know the Muslims don't like their women, so I don't like Muslims. And the Hindus, well, whatever. The Hindus have the caste system, so I don't like Hindus. I only knew enough to not like religion, because religion was a bad thing. Well, once I decided to write Life of Pi, I had to do research on religion. So I read all the classic texts, the sacred texts, and things about them. That changed my mind about religion. Then I also knew nothing about shipwrecks. I wrote about shipwrecks. I read about survival at sea. Once I read those things, that solidifies my initial idea and gives me more ideas, which gives me more avenues of research. So Life of Pi, I need an animal. Where's that animal going to come from? I thought, well, it could be a tiger, that ship that got pushed out by a tide out to sea. But to have a tiger from the Sundarbans pushed out to the middle of the Pacific, that's kind of unlikely. So it had to be on the ship to start with. So I thought the Patels could be a circus. But a circus, to me, is kind of a hokey literary device. And also, to have a circus on a ship, on a boat, on a ship traveling, circuses are not that wealthy. They don't travel that far. They're very local entertainments. So it had to be a zoo. But initially I said, I don't like zoos. No one likes zoos. Zoos are jails for animals. And I'm already taking on religion, which is not popular in Canada. I can't also take zoos. But I did my research. And then I researched, just as I was ignorant about religion, I'm ignorant about zoos. I have no idea. I didn't know that zoos operate the way they operate. So I did put in zoos in Life of Pi. So research gives me new ideas give me more research. And while I'm doing this, from the very start, I'm writing down things. I'm taking notes. So for my next novel, the Trojan War novel, I have about 600 pages of notes. And when I feel I've had enough, that I have enough to start with, I print up those notes, and they're completely scattered. You know, for Life of Pi, very clearly, sometimes it was vocabulary. One thing that I noticed, remember I said there's many Englishes. Well, what's charming to me about Indian English is you've kept words that we don't use anymore in Canada. And the one that I use that I mentioned in Life of Pi is bamboozle. It's very rare that in Canada I hear the word bamboozle. And I hear it in India. So it's one of these lovely words that I still hear. So one of the notes of the Life of Pi was the single word bamboozle. To say, okay, this is a word they like using here, I must use it in Life of Pi. But in writing my hundreds of pages of notes, I might forget that, so I put it there. So when I print up my notes, I cut them up. So the one little note was a very tiny snippet that had the word bamboozle. And that went in an envelope called vocabulary. And so I put all these notes in envelopes. And then I label the envelopes depending on what they contain. So I had one envelope that said vocabulary, likely words that I might go to if I wanted a particular Indian expression or an Indian turn of phrase. And I put these envelopes on the floor depending on where they might belong in my novel. So the narrative ones form a line. The ones that are the ones that are reference envelopes are above or below, and I'll occasionally go to them. And so I play around with them depending on, so it's the only time that my novel looks like a painting, that I can conceive it visually. And then when I start writing, well, quite literally, I open up the first envelope, and that is, for example, in Life of Pi, the first note was called Author's Note. And in that envelope were all the vague ideas that I had, some quite worked out, some very elliptical, ideas that I had for the author's note. And then the next envelope would be chapter 1. And so that's how I write. That's the framework I use. And so the last envelope was chapter 100. The investigator's report, a partial account of the investigator's report to the Ministry of Transport in Japan about this survivor that they met in Mexico. So that's the way I do it. That's my process.
And this will be the last question. Mr. Martel, I'm sorry, really. We gave you half an hour. Yeah.
Hi, Yann.
Quickly.
I find your ability to play with narratives, like multiple narratives, really inspiring. Now, I think that makes you a bit of a seeker, someone who's searching for something. So my question is, when you write a novel, how much of it for you is something you're giving to your audience, and how much of it for you is something you're giving to yourself, and you're searching for yourself, and how much of your novel is you, even in a long term? I hope the question makes sense.
That's a great question. Well, here, I'll tell you another thing that I love about India. Yeah. Okay, sure. Another thing that I love about India, and of course it's been abused and all that, is the idea of the guru, the centrality of the teacher. I had the luck of going to schools, good schools in Canada and abroad, and there's nothing more important than a good teacher, whether it's literally a teacher in a... Yes, you. Whether it's literally a teacher in a school, or a mentor, or a friend, or a parent, or someone, but we need teachers to go through life. We need teachers. Teachers guide us. So when I write a book, I am seeking to learn. So I read books, I talk to people. They are my gurus. And ultimately, art is a gift. You give it to the world. So I guess in that form, you become perhaps a guru, but a guru with more disciples. You hope you have disciples, and a lot of books don't have disciples. But the hope is that you will be read, and the readers will bring their imagination to your book and learn from it. But in a sense, you're not the guru as the writer. The seeker becomes the guru himself, herself, by bringing something to your book. And it's the book that teaches them. But really, it's a co-creation. Art is always a co-creation. Yes, there's a canvas on the wall, but you, in looking at it and bringing something to it, you co-create its meaning. So that guru-disciple relationship is constantly in flux. So when I write a book, yes, I'm seeking to understand for myself, and I'm wanting something, but there's also that social contract. Art only works when there's someone out there who hears you, reads you, listens to you. And it's an essential social contract. Otherwise, art is broken and we are broken. So there's a sort of a fluctuation between, yes, I give, but I also receive.
The second thing is that when I read Pi, this image of Santiago comes very often to my mind. Has Hemingway got any influence on you? And what if Pi was a female character? How would you like to draw it?
What have an influence?
Ma'am, would you just say influence of who?
Hemingway. Old man and
Hemingway.
Hemingway.
Hemingway, yeah.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that pretty well every Western writer has been influenced by Hemingway, because you either have the choice of a lot of words or too few words. So something about Hemingway's spare style has influenced me. Thank you. The music is coming, so I'm figuring that means we're done. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Gerry.
Please join me in thanking Yann Martel and Gerry Pinto. This session was brought to you by the Patrika Game.